It was supposed to be a peaceful family vacation. Greg Thomas, a successful CEO, had spent weeks planning this trip. He and his wife, Julia, had been working nonstop for months, and now they were ready to unwind, relax, and spend quality time with their two children. They boarded the plane with excitement, unaware that this flight would change their lives forever. Greg's company, Thomas International Airlines, was a major player in the airline industry. Greg had built the company from the ground up, working tirelessly to make it one of the largest and most respected names in aviation. But even with all his success, Greg was just a regular man in the eyes of most people. He dressed like everyone else, spoke like everyone else, and tried his best to keep his family's life as normal as possible. As they boarded the plane, Greg's mind was focused on the much-needed break ahead. The family was seated comfortably in first class, a luxury they had earned through years of hard work. The children were already excited about the in-flight entertainment, and Julia, as usual, was making sure everything was in order. Greg leaned back in his seat, ready to relax, when the flight attendant, Samantha, walked down the aisle. Samantha had been a flight attendant for years, working on numerous flights for Thomas International Airlines. She prided herself on providing excellent service and making sure every passenger was comfortable. But as she made her way down the aisle that day, she couldn't help but notice Greg. Something about him didn't sit right with her. Perhaps it was the way he looked or the way he carried himself. Maybe it was the fact that he didn't fit the stereotypical image of a wealthy CEO in her mind. He was just a regular black man, sitting with his family, enjoying a quiet moment. To Samantha, it seemed out of place. She wasn't used to seeing people like Greg in such positions of power. She assumed he was just another average passenger who was using his family's first-class privileges. As she approached Greg's seat, she gave him a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir. Could you please put your seatbelt on? We're about to take off," she said, almost without thinking. Greg nodded and complied, not giving it another thought. But Samantha wasn't done. She continued her usual rounds, but something was gnawing at her. As the flight took off, Greg settled in, ready to relax. But Samantha, unable to shake her assumptions about him, decided to take things further. She walked past the Thomas family once more and stopped just in front of Greg. "I'm sorry, but I noticed that your children are a little noisy. Could you please make sure they're quieter during the flight?" Samantha said, her tone not as friendly this time. Greg was taken aback. He had been a loyal customer of Thomas International Airlines for years, and he had never been treated like this. He looked up at Samantha, confused, but remained calm. "My children are fine, thank you. We're just trying to enjoy the flight," Greg replied. Samantha wasn't satisfied with his response. She raised an eyebrow, her judgmental expression growing more apparent. "I understand, but we do have rules about maintaining a certain level of quiet during the flight." "I'm just doing my job," she said, as though she were doing him a favor. Greg's patience was starting to wear thin, but he didn't want to escalate things. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he knew better than to react impulsively. He smiled politely and said, "I understand, but we'll be fine. Thank you." However, Samantha wasn't done. As she moved down the aisle, she shot an angry glance at Greg and his family, silently judging them. Little did she know, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The flight continued uneventfully for the next few hours. Samantha kept an eye on Greg's family, noticing every small thing they did. She watched as Greg's children played quietly with their tablets and noticed that Greg and Julia were speaking in low, pleasant voices, as any loving family would do. But something about Greg still bothered her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong in the luxury of first class. She knew that Thomas International Airlines was a business run by a powerful CEO, but she didn't think someone like Greg, a black man, would actually be the one in charge. She believed the stereotype that wealthy business owners all had a certain look, a certain type, and Greg didn't fit it. That's when things took a turn for the worse. As the flight reached its cruising altitude, Greg's family was settling in for a movie when Samantha returned to their row. She approached the family with an air of superiority, ignoring the obvious discomfort her presence was causing. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane," Samantha said, her voice cold and detached. Greg stared at her in disbelief. "What? Excuse me? You and your family are causing a disturbance. It's against company policy." I'm afraid I'll have to remove you from the plane, Samantha said firmly, the arrogance in her voice unmistakable. Greg was stunned. He had been on countless flights with his family and had never been treated like this before. He stood up, his face growing tense. Is this some kind of joke? He asked, his voice calm, but his patience starting to wear thin. What do you mean by disturbance? We've been quiet and respectful the entire flight. But Samantha wasn't listening. I'm following orders. You're causing a disturbance and I'm asking you to leave, she insisted. Her tone was final. At this point, the other passengers were beginning to notice what was happening. Some looked on in confusion, others in disbelief. They couldn't understand why Samantha was acting this way. Greg's family was being humiliated, and he knew something had to change. He turned to his wife, Julia, and calmly said, "Stay here. I'll handle this." Before Samantha could say another word, Greg walked to the front of the plane. He approached the cockpit and knocked gently. The door opened and the pilot, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked at him in confusion. "Can I help you?" the pilot asked. Greg took a deep breath. "I'm the CEO of this airline," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his authority. The pilot's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't recognized Greg earlier, just as Samantha hadn't. "I'm sorry. What?" he stammered. Greg calmly explained the situation. As the pilot processed the information, his face paled. He immediately stood up and made his way back to the cabin, realizing the gravity of the mistake. Moments later, the flight attendants were in the cockpit, trying to resolve the issue. But Greg knew this was just the beginning. He had been underestimated, not because of his capabilities, but because of his appearance. Samantha, who had arrogantly insisted on removing Greg's family, had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea that the man she had humiliated was the owner of the very airline she worked for. And when the pilot came out to apologize and remove her from the situation, she was left speechless. Greg had taken control without raising his voice, and in the end, Samantha had to face the consequences of her actions. The employees who mocked Greg had no idea who they were dealing with. They would soon learn that their assumptions had cost them dearly. What would you do if you were treated unfairly in a public space? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more incredible stories of empowerment and justice.